Hey everyone, it's Lori, and I am here today with my August reading wrap up. In the month of August, I read 11 books, and for the first time in months, it was not a majority audiobooks. I only listened to 2 audiobooks this month, and then I read 4 ebooks and 5 physical books. So I'm just going to kind of get started. I'm going to start with my fiction books, and then finally we'll do my nonfiction of the month. So starting off, we did a family read aloud of the last book of the Green Ember series. This is Embers End. I enjoyed this quite a bit. My younger daughter Charlotte really enjoyed this, but she has a much better memory for things that happen in books that it's been a while since we've read them. So my older daughter Eva just kept trying to remember what had happened in previous books, so that made things difficult. So this is about rabbits with swords, and there are rabbit love stories in the series, and it had kind of an enjoyable epilogue, so that was kind of nice, but it was kind of a longer epilogue, so it does have a nice happy ending for a good family read aloud of the series. I believe there are 4 or 5 books. I'm not really sure. I think it's 5. And then there's some side stories as well. So S.D. Smith is a very fun author for a family read aloud. Finished off the month by reading Young Men in Spats by P.G. Wodehouse. Wodehouse is probably best known for the Jeeves and Wooster series, which I just love because I love Jeeves. He is the greatest. So the downside to this book was there is no Jeeves, but it's kind of a short story collection, and it all starts with a bunch of young men in their club. It's called the Drones Club, and generally speaking, the people in the club aren't named. They might be called a whiskey and sour, or the bean said this, or whatever. And then the stories themselves have character names. So I had 2 probably favorite stories in here. The Amazing Hat Mystery is one that I really enjoy. That was probably one of my favorite ones in this collection, and it's a story where 2 young men who are in love with different young women both end up at hat shop at the same time to get nice top hats to impress the ladies, because apparently women just cannot resist a top hat by this particular hat maker. And so they get their hats and they go on their dates with the young ladies, and both ladies try to convince them that their hats aren't fitting properly, and then they have big arguments and kind of break up. So the 2 gentlemen end up at their club, and they're like commiserating together, and then they each leave and decide to go find the other one's girlfriend to see if they can fix things up a bit. And both of the women then compliment them on their hats. So it's just very funny because the interpretation of the men listening versus the interpretation of I think it's just one man listening. I think he was in the hospital and had a nurse, and the interpretation of the nurse are just so far different. It's just very funny. And then the final story in this, The Fiery Wooing of Mordred, was just a really funny story that starts with a trash can fire. Somebody throws a cigarette into a trash can, and that brings up this whole story of this relationship that starts between a man who has a tendency to start fires accidentally and this woman that he meets at the dentist's office. So that one was really hilarious too. But, P.G. Wodehouse is always a good time and just funny. Next up, I did the Close Reads Podcasts book this month, and that was The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. This was my first time reading, I believe, any Hemingway, and I thought it was okay. I actually appreciated it more as I listened to the podcast about it, and we haven't gotten to the Q&A podcast yet. So there's one more podcast to go on this one. Um, it's not a terribly long book, um, and literally almost nothing happens. Like, they're just hanging out in Paris, having meals and drinks. They decide to go to Spain. They watch some bullfighting and do some fishing. And yeah, that's pretty much all the actual action that happens, but it's more um, the fact that nothing happens is what makes it kind of interesting, because these characters are just kind of stuck. So it's a interesting novel. I may read it again someday because I have a feeling this is one that probably gets better upon more readings. But for now, I thought it was good, but not like the top book I read this month or anything. Next, I have a couple of sci-fi and fantasy books, and these I read both as ebooks. The first is The Relentless Moon by Mary Robinette Kowal. This is the third book in the Lady Astronaut series, and I have read the previous two books. The first one I listened to on Audible. The second one I checked out a copy from the library back when I actually went places. And this one I checked out a digital copy from the library. So the first two books focused on one character. And this book actually focused on a side character from those first two books. And I actually enjoyed this protagonist more than the one from the first two books. Her name was Elma. And I can't really put my finger on why. So the protagonist in this is Nicole Worgan, who is another one of the women astronauts, and she is also the wife of a senator. So her life is quite a bit different than Elma's because her husband is an engineer. So she's in like the political spotlight, and this book mostly takes place on the lunar colony. But there's all sorts of political stuff going on where some people are very upset about the space program and don't want money spent on it. So there have been some like terrorist acts and that sort of thing. And Nicole kind of has to help figure out what's going on and who on the moon might be a problem. So it's a fun book. It does have an interesting backstory, and this story is just a very interesting one that takes place at the same time of the second book in the series. So they're kind of happening at the same time. Another fantasy book that I finished was Sword of Destiny by Andrzej Sapkowski. I am almost certainly pronouncing that wrong. I apologize. Polish is hard for me. This is the second short story collection in the Witcher series. And it took me a long time to read. I am not the biggest fan of short stories. I actually find them kind of challenging. My husband likes short stories a lot more than I do. Not that there was anything wrong with the stories, it just, I like a little more of a narrative to keep me going. So I'm still not sure how I feel about The Witcher in general. I think I will give at least the first novel a try because I enjoyed quite a few things about the short stories, but they were just hard for me to slog through. So I'm hoping that when there's an overarching story, it will make it a little easier for me. So I do plan to do that at some point. Probably not in the next month. But I'm just not a short story person. So while this was okay to good, I'm hoping that the novels are a better fit for me. Moving into books that are a little bit hard to categorize. Maybe I could categorize both of these as satire. The first one is definitely a fiction book, and that is The Sellout by Paul Beatty. And this is a story of a black man living in a black town in California, kind of, I think, in the Los Angeles area, called Dickens, and the town disappears from the maps. And so he ends up kind of having this quest to get Dickens back on the map. And so it revolves around his Supreme Court trial. So he's at the Supreme Court because of this lawsuit that was brought against him that just goes back to him trying to get Dickens on the map and all of the crazy things that are happening. He's like this farmer. He's like got a horse and rides it around and has crops and smokes a lot of weed. It was an interesting book. I enjoyed it, but I'm not quite sure I could put a finger on why, besides the fact that it was very funny and satirical and just kind of crazy. Oh, and he was homeschooled as well, so I did appreciate that about the book. And then the other book that's satire that I don't really know whether to classify it as fiction, nonfiction, or what, is Walker Percy, Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. So this whole book is kind of like a faux self-help book where there's almost like a quiz where you're given a scenario and then you're supposed to pick from different choices what your response would be in that situation. It's weird. Maybe not as weird as the Sellout, because that also has this whole like linear-ish going back and forth. Okay, not really linear, but you could make it linear. It had a start and an end that you kept going back and forth between. And this really doesn't have any sort of linearness. It is a little bit dated because some of the things he writes about are kind of specific to the time it was written. So like some different talk show hosts come up and things like that. But it was enjoyable. I do enjoy Walker Percy. I do think I liked Love in the Ruins more than this, but this is just kind of a book that's really difficult to put your finger on what's going on. Now, moving into my nonfiction books. The first one I listened to this month was Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. And he is a surgeon. And so this is talking about the medical profession, but not just the medical profession. It's talking about aging. And so he talks a lot about what happens as we age, different cultural expectations for how old age is lived out. His parents were originally from India, and they came to the United States, and their father was taken care of in his home by his family members, because that's kind of the way things are done in that culture, or at least at that point. And he talks about nursing homes and assisted living and medical interventions and how doctors should talk to patients about impending death, and how doctors and patients should be working together to decide what is important for the patient. One of the big things he talks about is with cancer. A lot of times a cancer doctor, when he says we can do these treatments, the patient is thinking they're going to live 20 more years after these treatments, and the doctor may be thinking we might get another year or two of life after these treatments. So kind of making sure that the doctors and the patients can find a way to be on the same page. There's lots of information about like nursing home care and assisted living care, and some different experiments in those places that helped to increase quality of life. And perhaps the major idea behind the book is that quality life is more important than quantity life. So if you're doing all sorts of treatments that aren't going to gain a whole lot, but the person is going to be miserable through all these treatments. Is it worth doing those treatments? And kind of the American mindset is, if there is a treatment, you should do the treatment. But actually having this discussions is kind of the point of his book, Being Mortal. So I think this was probably the best book I read this month. But there's one other that really gave it a run for its money. So we'll get to that one next, actually. And the other audiobook I listened to, I don't know why the two audiobooks are my favorites of the month, is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. So apparently I'm just really into like medical-ish stuff right now, which is very weird because I'm not really that sort of person. But Why We Sleep is a book about sleep. Why we sleep, how we sleep, things that affect sleep, how to get better sleep, the different types of sleep, different stages of life with sleep, and just so much information about sleep. I did appreciate that the audiobook, it said if you fall asleep while listening to this, I will actually take that as a compliment because sleep is so important. And a lot of times when you learn something and then you sleep, it actually helps increase your understanding. So there have been a lot of experiments done where like you're taught something and one group is allowed to sleep a full amount and one group is allowed to sleep a little bit, and then another group is just sleep deprived to see what the retention rate is. And also with alcohol and all sorts of things. So it was just very interesting to see how very important sleep is in our lives. Another nonfiction book I read in ebook form was Weird by Olga Kazan. Olga Kazan talks about how people being weird can affect them either in good or bad ways, and the different reactions you can have to being weird, like going out and finding people like you so that you're less weird, or just embracing that weirdness. And she starts with herself, and she's not extremely weird, generally speaking, but she was a daughter of Russian immigrants that settled in Texas. So being Russian immigrants in Texas made her weird and her reaction to that, but she also tells the stories of some different trans women, a surgeon with dwarfism, another Russian, just a variety. It's people who politically are different from where they are living, both those that stay in a place where they are politically different and those that move away from a place where they were politically different to not be politically different. So it's very interesting to read all of these stories. I'm not sure if I really got a whole lot out of it, besides just like it's okay to embrace your weird, because I've always been a little bit weird. It was interesting to read, but perhaps not the most academic of books. She is a journalist, and it is written as though by a journalist, not an academic study of weirdness or anything. It's more of a almost memoir of weirdness. And and the last book I have to talk about is The Sinner's Guide by Venerable Louis of Granada. This is a beast of a book. This was for my Read Your Way to Heaven Year 3. And you can always tell when I'm having a hard time getting through something because I end up tabbing it up and being like, okay, if I just read this many pages, I can finish it by the end of the month. So that's how I got through this one. So he talks about sin, different types of sin, the virtues that can combat sin, and like it's broken down a lot. So you've got motives for virtue. Let's see, how many of those does he have? There's 11 motives for virtue, and then the privileges of virtue. He's got 12 privileges of virtue, and then we go into follies, and then into remedies against sin. And so the end from chapter 30 through chapter 39, those are all his remedies against sin. And then we've got more about justice and duty and obligation and so forth. So anyway, there's 48 chapters in this book, and it's like 459 pages. So this was a hard one to get through. There's some really great stuff in here. This is another one where I feel like if I come back a second time someday, I will probably get more out of it. But, there was a lot I could look at. There were a few things that really challenged me, particularly the sin of detraction. I think that's what it's called, which is basically like not telling lies about somebody, but telling truths about someone that make them look bad. So, struggling with that one a little bit, but that was what I finished up in terms of Catholic books this month. So those were all of the books that I read in the month of August. Please let me know in the comments if you've read any of these and have opinions, or if you have suggestions for me. I'd love to hear from you. Also, feel free to subscribe if you like monthly book wrap-ups and hauls and homeschooling content and that sort of thing. Anyway, I guess that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in my next one. Bye.